Hello and welcome to another Mr. Carter Science Special. In this video we'll be looking at evolution and speciation. In particular we'll be looking at the contributions of Alfred Russel Wallace to the theory of evolution by natural selection and his theories of speciation and how species are formed. So Alfred Russel Wallace was a naturalist who in the middle of the 1800s travelled to South America to collect plant and animal species. However, after his collection was destroyed, he then travelled to the Dutch East Indies, now known as Indonesia, to continue studying plants and animal specimens. And you can see a map of Southeast Asia and Indonesia here. So Wallace travelled widely across the Indonesian islands, and he noticed that on the western islands around here, the animals and plants were all very Asian, but the animals and plants on the eastern islands around here were all very Australasian. He proposed that there was a line separating the two, known as the Wallace line, that still is widely regarded and noted today. Whilst in Indonesia, Wallace contracted malaria, and during a malarial fever, he developed an understanding of evolution and natural selection similar to Charles Darwin's ideas. Alfred Russel Wallace wrote to Darwin outlining his ideas, and both Wallace and Darwin's ideas were presented to the Royal Linnean Society in London in 1858. Wallace's ideas were not as carefully crafted and researched as Darwin's. Both scientific papers seem to make very little impact. In 1859, Darwin published his book on the origin of species, you can see here, and he became forever associated with a theory of evolution by natural selection. Wallace continued to work all over the world gathering evidence, including warning colorations in animals and the role of geographic isolation in the formation of species. This is now known as speciation. So what is a species? Well, if we have a look at this example here, a species is a group of organisms with similar characteristics that can breed together and produce fertile offspring, i.e. the offspring will be able to breed itself. So there is a flow of genes from one generation to the next. So if we take an example of a horse and a donkey, they are very similar organisms with very similar characteristics. And indeed, their characteristics are so similar that horses and donkeys can breed together and produce offspring. The offspring is known as a mule. However, mules are infertile, so there is no gene flow from one generation to the next. The mule cannot have its own children. Therefore, horses and donkeys look similar, but they are different species. Yes, they have similar characteristics. Yes, they can breed together, but no, they cannot produce fertile offspring. So they do not meet the definition of a species. So how could a new species form? Well, Wallace's idea of speciation is outlined on this slide. If we look at this particular population here in our first diagram, we've represented the population with little sort of grey squares and circles. Now, if this one population is split into two and it becomes reproductively isolated, perhaps because a river has formed or changed its course and is splitting our population now into two areas to the left and the right of a river, we would now have one species spread across two different environments. So different adaptations will have advantages in each environment. So the different populations will change to become adapted to the different environments by natural selection. So different alleles will become more common in each separate population. And we've shown that here by sort of suggesting on the left of the river that the organisms are now sort of becoming a white colour, And on the right hand side of the river, the organisms are now becoming a darker black colour. Now, over many hundreds or thousands of years, perhaps even millions of years, if those populations are reunited and they can no longer interbreed and produce fertile offspring, then a new species has evolved. And as you can see, when the two species mix again, they are so different that they cannot produce fertile offspring. So we now have two new species evolving from one ancestral species. So a species is also a group of organisms that share structural and evolutionary features, and they can breed together and produce fertile offspring, as we've said. Speciation occurs as a result of reproductive isolation. Two isolated populations of the same species will experience different environments. Natural selection will occur in different directions, and over time different alleles and different characteristics or phenotypes will become more common in the new environments. So the genotypes and the phenotypes of the two populations will change and differentiate. Over time, if members of the two populations meet, they will no longer be able to breed and produce fertile offspring. Then we will state that a new species has evolved. A species can become isolated in different ways. The two main mechanisms are known as geographical isolation and environmental isolation. And we'll look at geographical isolation on this slide. Geographical isolation takes place when a population is physically or geographically separated. For example, as we've already mentioned, a new river may form, or as you can see in the breakup of the supercontinent Pangaea, a new sea or even a new mountain range may form over geological time. Earthquakes, for example, may split land. Volcanoes may form new islands, and again creating geographical isolation. The formation of islands often leads to the formation of new species, and we see this in a number of different places. Borneo and Indonesia, Australia, or even the Galapagos Islands are all famous examples of islands where new species have formed. However, geographically isolated species are very vulnerable to habitat loss, climate change and introduced species because they're often found on only one or two locations of remote islands and nowhere else in the world. The second mechanism is known as environmental isolation, and this takes place when a population is separated due to climate change in one area of a species range. For example, if one area becomes warmer, then a plant may flower at different times of the year. This means that the plants in different areas can no longer interbreed. So if we have one species of plant which perhaps in the north is flowering later than the same species 100 or 200 miles to the south, those individuals in the north cannot interbreed with the individuals in the south. So they are reproductively isolated due to a change in environmental conditions. And so they will evolve by natural selection to fit the two different environments, and eventually new species will be formed. So speciation takes place all the time, and speciation may involve a large area like Madagascar or Borneo, which can lead to some unique species being formed. For example, the slow loris here, the orangutan, and we have here the proboscis monkey with its large nose, also known locally as the Monyet Belanda, the Dutch monkey. Here is another example of speciation involving a very small area. And in this case, it involves a volcano known as Mount Bosovi in Papua New Guinea, to the very far east of the Indonesian archipelago, just north of Australia. Now, this is a picture of that mountain, and you can see that it's an extinct volcano with incredibly steep sides. This waterfall, for example, is several hundred meters high, so you can really get an understanding of the environment where these species are found. So this crater of the extinct volcano is only 4 kilometers wide, but the walls are 1 kilometer high. And the animals and plants that are trapped inside the crater are reproductively isolated from the animals and plants outside the crater. So they have evolved in different ways by natural selection to suit the environment found inside the crater. In 2009, scientists found 40 new species in the crater, including mammals, fish, reptiles, amphibians, insects, and an 82 centimeter long rat that weighs 1.5 kilograms. So how can we explain how this species of giant rat may have evolved from the original population trapped in the Mount Bosovi crater? Well, when the environment changed as the crater was formed, a population of rats became trapped inside, and there was variation in that rat population. With no predators, bigger rats had an advantage over smaller rats. They could control bigger territories, eat more food, and breed more. And so the bigger rats will be more likely to survive, breed, and pass on their alleles for the bigger size to their offspring. Over time, these alleles will become more common in the population, and the average length and mass of the rat species would increase. And indeed, you can see just how large this species of rat is when you compare it to the gentleman holding it in that picture. Now, the interesting thing about these paragraphs that I've been showing you in this video is that they are always the same. The key to describing how an organism may evolve by natural selection is to stating that the environment will have changed and that there will have been variation in the original population. You then just need to identify what the advantage will have been and state that the organisms or the individuals in that population that have the advantage will be more likely to survive, breed, and pass on the alleles for that advantage to the next generation. And so the advantage and the alleles for that advantage will become more common in that population over time. So we will see a slow, gradual change. I hope you've enjoyed this video on evolution and speciation. Let me know what you've learned about Alfred Russel Wallace and the mechanisms of reproductive, environmental and geographical isolation. Don't forget to subscribe and comment below and let me know what you've learned. Thank you very much.